Hi, I'm Dr. Jackson Crawford. I'm an Old Norse specialist and a historian of the Scandinavian languages, currently teaching at the University of Colorado Boulder, previously at UC Berkeley and UCLA. In this video, what I want to do is review some of the ways that the Scandinavian languages are related to the medieval language that we know as Old Norse, along the way addressing some of the ways that they might be more similar or more different from it. There's a common misconception that languages might be more or less similar to an extinct ancestor language, when in fact any given language that's descended from the same ancestor language as another probably has a mixture of both old and new features. To use an analogy from biological science, which one of my siblings is most similar to my grandfather? I might have more of his posture and bearing, my brother might have more of his facial features, and my sister might have more of his medical profile. But then each one of us that has that particular thing in common with him doesn't have the thing in common with him that the other siblings have. And the Scandinavian languages are like this in relation to their ancestor, which we can call Old Norse, although I'll explain in a moment why that term is sometimes not precisely what we need. Now, first of all, the Scandinavian languages are Indo-European languages. They share a common ancestor ultimately with most languages of Europe and Western Asia. These include, for instance, Latin, Greek, Armenian, Sanskrit, Pashto, Urdu, and many others. More specifically, the Scandinavian languages are Germanic languages in common with English, German, etc. that share a more recent common ancestor within the Indo-European family with those languages. Relative to other Germanic languages, the Scandinavian languages are distinguished by certain special features. I can't go into all of those in a fairly short presentation like this, but to give you an example, the semi-vowel y, the sound of y in an English word like young, disappears at the beginning of words in Scandinavian. So that, for example, English young is cognate with Old Norse ungur. Cognate means from the same ancestor word. Just as English year is cognate with Old Norse or. Just as English yoke is cognate with Old Norse ok. The y has simply dropped out in Scandinavian. One interesting single exception to this is the word jo, yes, which of course also has a y in its German and English cognates ja and yeah. Also in semi-vowels, the Scandinavian languages drop the sound of w very early on before a rounded vowel. So for instance, which is o and u and derived vowels. So for example, English word is cognate with Old Norse orð, just as English worm is cognate with Old Norse ormur, or English Woden, Old English Woden, is cognate with Old Norse Odin. So these are some distinguishing features in the phonology of the Scandinavian languages. Another example I might mention is the loss of in and im from the end of weakly stressed words in Scandinavian. So for example, English in is cognate with Old Norse e, English on with Old Norse å, and English from with Old Norse frå. In each case, the preposition, being a weakly stressed word, has lost the m or the n at the end, but it's still there in the closer related English language. Now, after undergoing these changes, which occur in what we can call the Proto-Scandinavian period, the Scandinavian languages have continued to change down the centuries up till today. Let's compare the same couple of sentences in a few different Scandinavian languages, old and modern, to see some of the characteristic differences and similarities that are there today. Keep in mind that I am an American, and so I do not have a native accent in speaking any of these languages, but I will do the best I can after many years of studying them.
So, what we have here is one of the most often requested phrases for me to translate into any language, which is, I love you. Now that's in the left column, and then the right column, you love me, in order for you to contrast how the grammar works in these different languages, how they handle the change of subject, whether that affects the way the verb looks at all. Now, first of all, looking at Old Norse, we can see ek anþér. That would be the typical way of saying I love you that we see in Old Norse texts. You love me is then þú ant mér. And then there is also a somewhat later expression using a different verb, ek elska þig, and the corresponding you love me, þú elskar mig. So let's take a look at a little bit of what's going on in these Old Norse sentences. First of all, note that in both variants, using both different verbs, Old Norse has to change the verb depending on who the subject is. So if I love, it's ek an or ek elska, but if you love, it's þú ant or þú elskar with an extra ending, either that T or that R. Old Norse is highly inflected, like most of the older Indo-European languages, such as Latin, Sanskrit, or Greek, as well as many modern languages today, which maintain a lot of verbal inflection, including the Romance languages. This is largely not maintained in the modern languages, as we will see. Another thing that is distinct in Old Norse inflection is that there are multiple different forms of different nouns, pronouns, adjectives, articles, etc. Depending on what role they have in the sentence, this is called case inflection. We have a little bit of this residually in English, since we say, I hit him, but he hit me, where I and he are subject forms, but me and him are object forms. But Old Norse goes a couple steps further and has multiple different object forms, and here what we see is both the dative and the accusative object forms of you and me. Now, traditionally in grammar, the dative, which we see in þeir and mer, is considered the case of the indirect object, but sometimes particular verbs in Old Norse call for the dative as their direct object, and love on is one of those. Notice that Icelandic maintains the same complexity. So in Icelandic, ég an þér, þú ant mér, and ég elska þig, and þú elskar mig. The differences in Icelandic are largely phonological. They concern how the sounds are pronounced. So notice, first of all, that the K at the end of ek and thik and mik, I, you, me, has become a G, and that G is actually pronounced as a fricative, not as a stop g as in English, but with friction against the top of the mouth, mig. The change of a K to a G is not unusual in weakly stressed words and languages the world over, so that shouldn't shock us, and something similar has obviously happened in the other Scandinavian languages if you look further down those columns. Another interesting thing that happens in Icelandic is this development. If you look at the word for I, from ek to ég, that long E symbolizes a e vowel that is preceded by a onglide y. So that if English yes were an Icelandic word, it would be spelled long E S. Let's look a little bit about how Old Norse is spelled. Now, Icelandic is very conservative in the way that it spells words. Faroese really is too, although Icelandic is kind of the champion at this. The letter thorn that you see standing for the th sound, the voiceless interdental fricative in þér and þig and þú in modern Icelandic and also in Old Norse, that letter, of course, is not used in any of the other modern Scandinavian languages because that sound has disappeared. The voiceless interdental fricative, the sound of th in thin, theater, thor, has become a T, occasionally D and H in other modern Scandinavian languages. So Icelandic is also very conservative with some sounds. One interesting question about the way that Old Norse is spelled that Icelandic today doesn't really help us resolve is why some letters are written double consistently. What exactly does it mean that A-N-N, love, is a different word from A-N, an archaic word for than? Probably what it means when consonants are written double in Old Norse is that they are pronounced
a little bit longer. So A and N being an versus AN being on, just held a little bit longer in the mouth. In modern Icelandic, there generally isn't a difference between the doubled consonant and the single consonant, except after certain long vowels and diphthongs. So, for example, in after A and on, love, is just an N, ég an þér. But that double N after a diphthong like EI in a word like itten is pronounced TN in modern Icelandic. So modern Icelandic has reflexes of some kind of difference in the proto-language, or proto-language, ancestral language. Old Norse is not a proto-language in the normal sense because it is well attested. But it's very unlikely that TN pronunciation in Icelandic was present in Old Norse, because otherwise we'd expect it to be spelled something like TN in Old Norse. When an alphabet, such as the Roman alphabet, is first adapted for writing a new language, such as Old Norse in the mid-1100s or so, you are typically going to write it as phonetically as possible, according to the standards of the day. Standards of the day were medieval Latin. You would expect to sound like basically a TN to be spelled like a TN in that convention. So modern Icelandic doesn't always help us perfectly resolve how Old Norse was pronounced, but it can give us some hints about similarities and differences between sounds that are present at that earlier stage. Now let's take a look at Faroese. Faroese also preserves inflectional grammar as Icelandic does. So notice, for example, that the verb for I love is elski, and for you love is elskar, with different endings. Although the endings are not the same as in Icelandic, because in Faroese, all verbs, or almost all verbs except present verbs, take the ending letter I in the first person singular. So in Faroese, I love you, elskite, you love me, tu elskar me, tu elskar me. There are some differences here. Faroese, of course, has not developed the y glide like we see in ég in Icelandic. As mentioned before, it has the ending letter I, the sound I, in all first-person verbs except for a small class. And we see that the sound th has developed into a T in the word te, you, from earlier thick. So some interesting differences there. But one of the most striking differences with Icelandic versus Faroese is that Faroese has a certain amount of palatalization. In linguistics, we talk about palatalization when velar consonants, such as the consonant sound of k or g or sk, are moved forward in the mouth from the hard palate or velum to the soft palate. So that typically results in changes like k becoming cha, g becoming j or ya, ska becoming sha. These are changes we see in all of the Scandinavian languages spoken today, except for Icelandic and way on the other end of geography and other developments, Danish. Faroese does have a certain amount of it, and in the pronunciation of elski, we see a palatalization of the sk. It is not pronounced ska, but as either a fricative sh, or depending on dialect area in the Faroes, as I understand it, can be pronounced as a fricative plus affricate sh, elski. So some interesting changes, and also, of course, the vocalization of the G, where the EG and A te me, I you me, that G has become part of a diphthong, or even just dropped entirely and just lengthened the preceding vowel so that there's no trace of that G there anymore. It's just A elske, tu elskar me. Another big difference between Faroese and Icelandic, and also the other Scandinavian languages, is that the R sound in Faroese is unique to it. It is more like the tap sound that you hear in the English R, rather than the trill that you hear in Icelandic, Swedish, Norwegian, or the uvular fricative or approximant that you hear in Danish and some southern varieties of Swedish and Norwegian. Now, speaking of Swedish, let's look at that continental Scandinavian language first. as in some respects it is the most conservative of the mainland mainstream conventional languages. Dialects of Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish may all have more conservative features than these standard languages that I'm using as stand-ins for those dialect groups. So Swedish, I love you, we have jag älskar dig, and you love me, du älskar mig. So notice that, like Icelandic, Swedish has developed a glide, a y sound at the beginning of the word for I. However, this has a different origin in Swedish than it has in Icelandic. In Icelandic, that y glide enters in at a time when all of the long vowels are diphthongizing, and it seems to be kind of a reverse diphthong from a situation that in earlier Icelandic may have been something like a. But in Swedish, what you've got is actually the Old East Norse form of I is eka. So the language that we typically call Old Norse is really Old West Norse. It's the language of medieval Iceland and Norway before roughly the time of the Black Death in about 1380. The medieval language of Sweden, Denmark, and the island of Gotland is subtly and sometimes not so subtly different. It's still clearly very close, clearly mutually intelligible, but it has some significant differences. And in Proto East Norse, the word for I was eka, as it almost assuredly was in Proto West Norse too. But what's happened in Old West Norse is that it has lost the A at the end of eka without that A leaving a trace. But in Old East Norse, that A didn't drop before it had broken the E in front of it into a ya. That sound change, called breaking, is quite characteristic of the Scandinavian languages, and I have covered it in more detail in another video. So as I mentioned earlier in this video, Old Norse can be a kind of imprecise term because since Old West Norse is so much better preserved, there's so many more documents written in it. We typically just fall back on that when we're talking about the medieval language of Scandinavia, although it's not a perfect representative of the ancestor of Swedish, Danish, Gutnish, or the many very divergent dialects of East Norse, such as Älvdalska in Sweden. So another thing to notice about Swedish is that the verbal inflection is significantly reduced. The word for I love and for you love is the same. It is just älskar. This, of course, comes from the old second or third person singular ending in the medieval language, but it has spread to all forms of the verb. So this is kind of like how in English we have I love, you love, he loves, we love, y'all love, they love. But if the third person singular ending had spread to all of these, so something like I loves, you loves, he loves, we loves, y'all loves, they loves. Not an unbelievable scenario for an English dialect, but this is actually standard in all of the continental Scandinavian languages. There is just one present tense ending for every verb. So that is a noticeable change. Also, we have the switch in low-stressed words from K to G, although kind of like in Faroese, that G is typically not heard in most Swedish dialects, although it is in some. There is also the change of th to, unlike in Faroese, a D here. So typically in unstressed words or low-stressed words in the mainline languages, the old th becomes D rather than T. So day coming from earlier thick. And then we also have the interesting spelling difference that Swedish has, where the short E sound is spelled as A with 2 dots, the symbol called diaeresis. Now Danish is the other mainland language in the East Norse group. Here we have jeg elsker dig and du elsker mig for I love you and you love me. Now in Danish, note that the second syllable in the word elsker love has become a schwa, or the vowel has become schwa rather than a. In Danish, already in the 1300s or so, it seems, all unstressed vowels had become schwa, which is spelled with a letter E. Danish also has the change from eka to, in the medieval language, yak, becoming modern yai, also with the G silent. The G is also silent in die and my, you and me, although here it has also modified the pronunciation of the preceding vowel. Danish has a different R sound than the other standard languages. It has a uvular approximant or fricative, er. A little bit difficult for me to imitate perfectly all the time, but this is more similar to the sound in French and German, and probably entered Danish in the 1700s or so under influence from those prestigious neighbor languages. The sound has also spread now to much of coastal southern and western Norway, and is also heard in southern Sweden and parts of the country that were once part of the Danish kingdom, such as Skåne. Now, I have Norwegian on here twice to reflect the two different official written variants of Norwegian, bokmål and nynorsk. Bokmål, which is at the top, is a derivative of written Danish that stems from the fact that Norway was part of the Danish kingdom for many hundreds of years, and thus the official language and the prestige language of the country became Danish, but Danish in its written form, still pronounced with a distinct Norwegian accent. So bokmål, the one of the two official written standards of Norwegian, is based on modified written Danish, although with a Norwegian accent. So as you may note, that first row displaying Norwegian is not very different from Danish. In fact, the only difference is in how the object form of you and the word me are spelled with E's rather than I's. So in a typical southeastern Norwegian pronunciation of bokmål, you would get something like Jeg elsker deg and Du elsker meg. Jeg elsker deg, Du elsker meg. I love you, you love me. Here we see nothing in particular to remark as opposed to Danish, except for the very different accent. There is a sort of musical tone to Norwegian and to Swedish that is not present in Danish. And also the R sound, except in coastal southern and western Norway, is the short trill, or I hesitate to say tap because that can make you think of the English sound, but it's often not as long of a trill as in Spanish. Think more of a Scottish R. Then the other official written variant of Norwegian, nynorsk, is based on an average of different Norwegian dialects as collected by the linguist Ivar Aasen in the mid-19th century. So since what he was trying to do was to produce a sort of average on the Norwegian dialects that was also very clearly derivable from written Old Norse, the language can have a somewhat more conservative appearance relative to Old Norse than bokmål has. Of course, part of that is that bokmål, being derived in its written form or pronunciation from Danish, which is East Norse, looks less like what we think of as Old Norse because so much Old Norse literature is preserved in Old West Norse. And of course, Norwegian dialects are going to be more likely to have West Norse features than, say, Danish. So we see, like Faroese, Norwegian nynorsk reflects a common Norwegian dialectical form where the glide ja has not developed in the word I, so we just have egg. Of course, there's a lot of dialectal variation here. You can hear, for instance, a and many other things all around Norway. Notice also that the unstressed vowel in the second syllable of love has not become a schwa. It remains a, like in Icelandic, Faroese, and Swedish, unlike Danish and Norwegian bokmål, and that G is still pronounced in the sort of average dialect this is based on, rather than just becoming silent or becoming a glide after the vowel. So we get eg elskar deg, du elskar meg, eg elskar deg, du elskar meg, for I love you, you love me. Now, of course, this presentation does not reflect every possible dialect, every possible pronunciation of these words and phrases. There are many more out there, but it would be impossible to present every single one in a sort of introductory review presentation like this. Let's go a little bit more in depth looking at the forms of a common verb in the different languages, as verbal grammar is one of the most complex aspects of Old Norse grammar and one of the most dramatically simplified aspects of grammar in most of the modern Scandinavian languages. I'm going to show you the West Norse versus East Norse languages on different slides, both for sort of fairness of comparison and, well, simply to have larger text on the screen. So notice in Old Norse, classical Old Norse, like you would learn in an Old Norse textbook, I recommend, at present, I recommend the Old Norse textbook called A New Introduction to Old Norse by Anthony Fawkes and Michael Barnes. You would see these forms of the verb take, taka, ek tek, thu tekur, han tekur, ver tokum, takið, þeir taka. That means I take, you take, he takes, we take, y'all take, they take. All right, so notice that the root here is tak, and yet what we've got in Old Norse are 3 different vowels in the root depending on the form of the verb. So in all of the singular forms, we have the vowel e, and then in the first person plural, we have this vowel o kaudata, which represents a rounded low vowel, and o in Old Norse. The reason for these different vowels is umlaut. I have a separate video, as I've mentioned before, where I talk quite a bit about the phenomena of umlaut and how they affect words in Old Norse, so check that out if you're interested in more. Now, if you look at modern Icelandic, all of the forms there are clearly direct continuations from the Old West Norse forms. Ég tek, þú tekur, hann tekur, við tökum, þið takið, þeir taka. Obvious differences include the fact that there is now a svara bhakti vowel, so-called, between the K and the R in the second and third person singular. This is standard in modern Icelandic, where Old Norse had a consonant followed by an ending R. That ending R is now preceded by a vowel U. You see this in nouns too, where R is a common ending in masculine nouns. Also, the vowel o kaudata, that low back vowel, has become a front vowel in modern Icelandic, and it is now written O with diaeresis or 2 dots. But otherwise, the forms are obvious direct continuations from Old Norse. Notice one interesting thing is that the pronouns for we and you plural, or y'all, you guys, are different from the normal pronouns for those in Old Norse. What's happened is that Old Norse has both a plural we and plural you, but also a dual we and dual you for specifically we too and you too. What's happened in Icelandic and Faroese is that they take the old dual we and you and turn those into the normal words for we and you. They're no longer dual, they become just regular plural. So in Old West Norse, we have ver for we and for y'all, later þeir, but we have dual vit and þit, and that's what's continued by Icelandic við, þið, and Faroese vit, tit. Also, many Norwegian dialects have forms based on the duals too.
Now, the Faroese verb retains some complexity, although not all 6 forms as in Icelandic. Or rather, I should say all 5 forms for the 6 persons and numbers. In Faroese, we have a reduction of all of the plural forms to 1 based on the third person plural. And then the typical Faroese replacement of the first person singular I ending in all verbs with a form ending in the letter I, sound E. So here we have Faroese taji, tu tegur, ta tegur, vit tega, tit tega, tair tega. The palatalization that you hear when K precedes an I, so that is tachi or taji rather than taki, is characteristic of Faroese. And I've mentioned palatalization before, and we'll get into a little bit more of that later. But often grammatical paradigms like this do alternate between forms that have palatalization and forms that don't. Now, if we look at the Norse example, which is based, again, on something of an average Norwegian dialect, we see that this is even more simplified, so that the second or third person singular form, without its ending R, has become generalized to the entire paradigm. Egtek, dutek, hantek, metek, ditek, ditek. One interesting thing that you see in a lot of traditional Norwegian dialects is what we see there in that word we, where the M is actually not from the Old Norse word for we, which begins with a V, but from the ending of the verb, which ends with an M, with that ending attaching to the pronoun. All right, here we have the East Norse forms of the verb take, Old Norse taka. The Old East Norse forms that I'm showing here are early literary Old East Norse, so roughly contemporary with the 1200s or so language that I'm showing for Old West Norse. At an earlier stage in runic inscriptions, we do see an amount of grammatical complexity that's more similar to Old West Norse, but in our earliest literary documents in Old East Norse, already the singular has more or less fallen together into a form based on the old second or third person singular, in this case, takar. Notice also that the umlaut on the vowel in the root is not present in the present singular in East Norse. Notice also that though there are still 3 different forms in the plural in Old East Norse, not all the forms are exactly the same. And a are very similar to the first person and third person plural in Old West Norse, but then in is very different from the second person plural eth in Old West Norse. The origin of that in form is still a subject of debate. Notice also that the words for we and plural you in Old East Norse are different from in Old West Norse, where there is a long I rather than a long e. So Old East Norse vir and ir next to Old West Norse ver and Now in Swedish, we see, as has happened in all of the standard continental Scandinavian languages, the old second or third person singular form ending in R has become the general form for all persons and numbers in the present tense. So these are all simply tar. Yatar, dutar, hantar, vitar, nitar, and domtar. While the word for they is written de, descending from the old nominative form, the form of it that is actually spoken is dom, which descends from the old dative form them rather than from nominative ther. Notice also that East Norse has monophthongization, so the ei that you see in Old West Norse ther is simply ther with a long e in Old East Norse. The word for y'all or you plural in Swedish is also worth noting. The in that begins the word for you plural in Swedish is actually from the ending of the verb in Old East Norse. So what's happened is, like I discussed with me in some Norwegian dialects and Nynorsk, the verbal ending has become the beginning of the pronoun in the modern language, which we don't see in Danish ye. Now again, what I'm doing is looking at the standard languages as representatives of the dialects in their parts of Scandinavia, but there are many very different dialects in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, and especially in parts of Sweden that are isolated or were once isolated you find dialects that are so unintelligible to speakers of standard Swedish that they can be called their own language. One interesting example of that is the language that calls itself Älvdalsk in Swedish, Älvdalska in English, sometimes called Elfdalian. This language still has, to this day, distinct forms for the first, second, and third person plural, but they pattern with the West Norse endings. They are id, a, sometimes o, depending on the length or weight of the preceding syllable. So there are dialects that do maintain much more conservative features. And what's interesting too is that then a dialect like Älvdalska shows not just archaic East Norse features, but archaic West Norse features, reminding us that these barriers are not necessarily hard and fast. You also see that in the fact that Älvdalska has the form ig for I without the onglide ja that you see always in the East Norse dialects like Swedish, Danish. Now in Danish, we see that a similar grammatical development has taken place as in Swedish. All of the forms are now based on the old second and third person singular. However, in Danish, the form of the second person plural, you, y'all, does not have the N that has been excreted from the ending of the old verbal ending. This, in my version of Danish, would then read something like jeg tager, du tager, han tager, vi tager, I tager, de tager. It's just ta the whole way through, with the G not pronounced. This is a monosyllabic word in the mainline Scandinavian languages. And then the Bokmål forms are based on a Norwegian pronunciation of that Danish form, so it's basically the same thing, just with a more Norwegian trilled R, or of course it could also have the uvular R depending on where you are in Norway. Jeg tar, du tar, han tar, vi tar, der tar, de tar. Now notice that the second person plural, the y'all form there, dera, is based on a regional Norwegian form in the southeast for you plural y'all. That is based on an Old West Norse form of the you plural pronoun. Actually, one of the most variable forms of the in all these languages is the form of plural you. Now let's look at one of the really characteristic sound changes that we see in many of the modern Scandinavian languages, which is palatalization. As I mentioned earlier, palatalization typically involves a sound made in the back or hard palate, the velum, moving forward into the soft palate, and this typically also includes fricativization or affrication. So if we look at Old West Norse, which I'll use in place of Old West Norse and Old East Norse since the forms would be very similar, we have ship being pronounced skip, sea is pronounced sjor, kettle pronounced ketil, married pronounced gifter, and gift pronounced gåva. Probably long A was already rounded in all of the Scandinavian languages, Old West Norse and Old East Norse, by 1200 or so. Now in Icelandic, although some of the vowels have changed, as well as the double L gaining its characteristic Icelandic TL pronunciation, the beginning velar stops are not going to, and fricatives, and in the case of SJ, you've got a fricative plus glide, are going to be pronounced the same. So skip, sjor, ketil, giftur, gáva. There you have one really characteristic Icelandic vowel change, which is the old rounded long A to ow. In Faroese, you see these all palatalized except the last one. So you get Faroese ship, shegvur, chetil, giftur, gåva. So all of those sounds are palatalized except the G in the last example because that precedes a back vowel, and typically that is an environment where you don't get palatalization. Same thing in Norwegian. Skip, sjø, kjelle, gift, gova. Some Norwegian dialects also have the same palatalization outcomes as Faroese, so there's parts of Norway, especially in the west, where you can hear, for example, something more like skip, sjø, kjelle, gift, although that is not as common. In Swedish, what you get from this are somewhat different palatalization outcomes. Skepp, sjö, kittel, gift, gåva. And then in Danish, along with Icelandic, again on the very other end of a lot of other historical developments, you get no such palatalization. So you get skib, sø, kille, gift, and gave, or it's really something more like give. So these palatalization changes probably begin with something like a glide, ya creeping in after the stop consonant, the K, G, or SK early on, possibly already in the Old Norse period, and then that gradually causing the consonant preceding to be pronounced further and further forward in the mouth. A lot of Swedish dialects have outcomes that are a little bit more like the Norwegian outcomes. For example, in Finnish Swedish, you see something more like the Norwegian outcomes than like the Swedish outcomes that I gave you, which are based a little bit more on Central Swedish, Stockholm, Uppsala type area. Now let's wrap this up by looking at a few miscellaneous sound changes that show interesting differences of development in the modern languages. I believe that the letter V already spelled the sound of V in the Old Norse period, but of course that V is coming from a Germanic W. So most words in Old Norse that have a V have a W in English, like vatten, water, vel, well, etc. And my belief that this was already a V is based on rhymes and skaldic poetry, with F, which typically spells a V sound except at the beginning of words. At any rate, it seems like the W sound of V persisted after another consonant, such as H, so that I theorize, as do many other scholars of Old Norse, that the Old Norse word for what, HVAT, was in fact pronounced much like an older American English pronunciation of that consonant sequence, what. What's interesting is that in West Norse, for the most part, this has become a KV sound, so that the Icelandic descendant of that is kvad, and the Faroese is kvad. And then in Norwegian Nynorsk, based on the sound that you hear in many Western Norwegian dialects, you get kva. But then in East Norse, mostly that is reduced to just a V sound without any preceding consonant sound. So in Norwegian Bokmål, where that's HVA, it's simply va, Swedish va, Danish va. And the H, even if it is still spelled, is now silent. However, there are dialects in both Denmark and Sweden where you can still hear a W in this word, at least in older speakers of regional dialects, such as in North Jutland in Denmark. And then in eastern Iceland, there remain some older speakers who will say hwað with that old W sound. So I think there's fairly good support for the notion that this was once hwa. Then if we look at the way that the internal fricative, the th sound, has developed, we see in Old Norse thorskr, that is cod, the fish. Modern Icelandic thoskur, of course, still maintaining that fricative, but then in all the other Scandinavian languages, that has become a T today. So Faroese, toskur, Norwegian, Swedish, torsk, and then Danish tosk. But what's interesting is that when thorn is in a lightly stressed word, word that's naturally not going to receive a lot of stress in a sentence like these, Old Norse thessi,
you can get slightly different outcomes. Of course, Icelandic still has thesi, but then in the continental languages, you get a D. So various forms like dessa, dessa, dissa. But in Faroese, you get kind of various results for that unstressed thorn. So here, for instance, we see an H, Hessin, which is a little bit unusual. Hard to say exactly why Faroese sometimes has an H and sometimes a D from these low-stress thorns. And then you see another low-stress word like you that we saw in the example for you love me, thu becoming Faroese tu, which has the stressed outcome of thorn. So something interesting has gone on with Faroese interdental fricatives. Then there are some famous consonant changes in Icelandic, sometimes also reflected in Faroese, that are not there in the continental languages. So even though Icelandic is remarkably conservative with its grammar and with the maintenance of the sound thorn, it is strikingly innovative in other ways. So an example of this is the Old Norse word for mountain, fjall. In modern Icelandic, that's fjall. The double L has become articulated as effectively TL, and the same thing in Faroese with fjall. Then on the continent, we have no such outcomes. So Norwegian fjall, Swedish fjall, Danish fjall, with the LD in Danish spelling often an old LL, just as in Danish often ND spells an old NN, but the D is not pronounced. This change is part of a series of interesting consonant changes that happen in Icelandic with sequences of 2 or more consonants that just remind us that even if one given language such as Icelandic is very conservative with certain aspects of its grammar, it may in fact be very innovative, strikingly different from its parent language in aspects of its phonology.
In summary, no language is capable of being passed down from generation to generation without changing. Every language is then a mixture of old and new features, and the Scandinavian languages are no exception. No particular language is in all respects the closest to Old Norse, not even modern Icelandic, although modern Icelandic does have strikingly conservative grammatical features. I hope this video has been somewhat interesting and informative for you. And for now, from beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.